everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good day. My name is Stephanie Boozer, and I am with CUGC HQ, and I am very happy to welcome you to today's user share on NetScaler, Office 365, and Azure. I think it's going to be a very interesting story to hear today. Presenting for us is CTP Thorsten Rood. He is a principal architect and team lead in app networking. And he is very kind to share with us today. Want to let you all know that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on mycugc.org afterward, and you will also receive a link via email from GoToWebinar sometime tomorrow. And also, if you have questions, we'd love to have you type those into the question area of the GoToWebinar control panel over to your right. And Thorsten is going to be taking some breaks during his presentation to take a look at those questions. All right, we can go to the next slide. And for those of you who are new to CUGC, just want to let you know that you should come on by mycugc.org. We have over 17,000 members around the world, as well as 60 local user groups and special interest groups. And there are tons of resources for you on our site, lots of webinars, blog posts, forum discussions, a lot of stuff for you to come and check out. So we hope to see you there. And with that, I will turn things over to Thorsten to get us started. Here you go.
Okay, thanks much, and welcome everybody. So depending on your daytime feeling, it's either daylight or almost getting to the midnight area. So for me, it's actually evening. So welcome to the end of your workday, in case it's me, and welcome to the start or whatever. Hopefully you feel comfortable with that. The schedule for today is a 19 minutes, roughly speaking, webinar. And I've made some ideas about how to put that forward, which looks like this. So this is the expectation for the, I would say, roughly 18 minutes from now. I've brought with me something that tries to bring some insights into what NetScaler is about in the context of Microsoft Azure and 365. And you may have noticed the subtitle, a surprise story that was actually chosen because over the long time right now, I felt like a lot of things just have been left unspoken, and so they are not most commonly known to everybody. And this is kind of an approach to summarize that back in kind of a quick essence of what it is about. And you see from that schedule that we actually will cover two portions of how to look on the combination of NetScaler and the Microsoft Cloud. So the first half of this webinar is roughly about infrastructure with a pure focus of how to do that with Zen Desktop, for sure. And then we have a break, as Stephanie already mentioned. I'm doing that webinar alone, and I'm not keen on having thousands of questions in the end. So the idea is to give you a chance to post your part one questions over the course of part one. I'm collecting them right after about 20 minutes or so from now. I'm trying to answer at least a subset of those. And then we switch to part two, and the part two is more the application perspective when it deals with Azure AD and Office 365 and how NetScaler fits into all that picture. So that is another chance to get out with more questions about that, so kind of part two questions. That doesn't mean that you may not ask questions about part one, but the idea is that the second Q&A covers the second part. The chances that something has been left over for later. We are collecting everything. I'm trying to give an answer on any single question that is out there. So we have a gigantic recording backlog for that. Bear with me, it takes eventually a few days to cover all of them. So eventually we'll try to prioritize a few of those questions. I will read them anyway, so doing that live as good as possible. And for those of you that stay with us for the whole time, there's a quiz at the end with a little giveaway. And of course, the trick to get you all with me is the quiz will cover both part one and two, so you must stay with me until the end. So I think you got the trick with that. And with that, I would like to start off with some intro about cloud and how NetScaler fits in there, just to get you in the right mood. I think that is the way we should start right now. So that's it. This is the attempt I hear from customers. It's typically something like saying, I want to avoid things, I want to deal with less technology than before, because everybody proposing cloud to be simpler than before. And so the most obviously heard question is, hey, going to cloud, why do I have to deal with NetScaler at all? So if there's really a love between those 4 elements on screen, it's not necessarily that people dislike NetScaler, but it's a fair question to ask which components in a future cloudified data center are still needed and what is their role. Maybe if the outcome is that we need those components, clarification about the role of those features and functionality is more needed. That's why I'm saying it's a surprise story, because a lot of things I think are not that much known to the public. So with that, a few abstractions first. It's, I would say, these badass slide just to differentiate what we're talking about. If it's about cloud, doesn't matter which one, especially, it doesn't matter it's Azure or Amazon, but especially on Azure, it's still the same thing. You need to think what you deal with if you cloudify your data center stuff. It's about layers and quality of service that you get back from each of those layers. So the ground layer is infrastructure. That basically means you do all the stuff yourself. It's just somebody that hosts the stuff for you, but you are in full control and responsibility for these running machines. The mid-tier is something in between that is not that often used from a Windows shop perspective. It becomes more visible these days, but the majority is either being on the ground layer infrastructure or on the top layer, software as a service, the SaaS element, where you buy into something where you actually have no control at all from the technology perspective. You just buy into a functionality, which is where the savings come from, obviously. If you buy into software as a service, you subscribe to something that somebody else provides to you. If you subscribe into infrastructure, you just want something in a kind of a place on the planet to host it, but do it yourselves, either because of technology reasons or because of complexity or because there's somebody that actually doesn't have that offering. And so it's in between. And so the first part, which we are going to quickly, is more like about infrastructure. And the second part is about more as that software as a service perspective, how Azure will feel like for you. And there's an important differentiation here. It's not about to read that actually. As it gets recorded, you can put the pause button quickly and just read that in detail. My main message on that table is, if you are on infrastructure, it is your responsibility to make sure that it just works. If it is software as a service, you subscribe to something where you subscribe to an SLA. So how it is built, how it is maintained, how it is operated, it's just their problem. If you are on the infrastructure tier, so left-hand side, it is actually your problem to make sure that all that stuff just keeps working. And that's the main difference if you deal with cloud-based stuff. If you just strip off the, I would say, the hardware layers and the ground tier stuff and still maintain things yourself, you need to be the architect on availability, on durability, and operational perspectives. If you subscribe to a software as a service, it's the comfortable way. So you give up a certain thing, or you basically give up control about the technology on ground layer and feel good that somebody else does the stuff for you. And that's the thing. So with that differentiation, the key takeaway is, if you're on infrastructure, make sure that resilience is still your responsibility. If you're on a software as a service layer, the resilience is just there because of the SLA. So make sure that you subscribe to something that has an SLA and that SLA meets your need. If it doesn't meet the need, it's the wrong product for you. So first part, the actual really first part one now, it's Zen Desktop infrastructure, potentially in Azure or with Azure. So it's about this. This is where we typically come from. I think you will see those components yourself day by day. If you operate Zen Desktop, kind of. So you have your VAs with the workload. You have some middleware in between, which is typically the storefront. So we talk about Zen Desktop FMA architecture, obviously. So the delivery controller is there. You may have NetScalers for internal balancing your storefront needs and other stuff. You have the external NetScalers in terms of the gateway to connect users from the outside, which is top left portion, like the receivers. And of course, you have the right-hand side receivers, which are corporate clients, typically connected to a kind of MPLS or whatever. So that's the two things how to deal with that. And just to make sure, I think some of you know about my background. I did that app space stuff a long time ago, so I know about the relationship between the VDA and the application running on that, with the critical sensitive dependency on the back end that this application typically needs access to. All these diagrams, however, that I will show you will never deal with the back-end services that your application subscribes to. So it's a simplification that is just needed for here. So if there is some application that needs to be close by any database, the assumption is that you have taken care about the fact that you have a good relationship to the database in terms of latency, bandwidth, and stuff like that. But it would explode just the diagram if you would not simplify with that. So that's the on-premises status quo. And the cloud question comes in asking, okay, how can I expand my footprint? My footprint to expand there typically means you connect to Azure and place some VDAs there, right? It can be for whatever reason. It can be that burst thing that you need more capacity sometimes. Or it could be a DR thing. You say, hey, it's just too freaking costly for me to just duplicate my data center stuff for DR purposes, especially if I can afford shutting those machines mostly down, unless there's really an outage. But I need the other data center to survive the day if something goes wrong. So you have these two sides side by side. So the assumption here is that there's on-premise versus an Azure infrastructure zoo, which at least has a DDC in there and a VDA. And as I was saying, because of simplification, it has also some back-end application support service in there because the applications don't make any sense without the data behind. You have an express route connection, which is the absolute recommendation to connect to Azure if it comes to bandwidth and throughput. Although self-built VPN side-to-side things don't scale that well when it comes to transmission that has a certain footprint. If it's just for Connect, it's good, but if you really need to provide data throughput, express route is the ultimate way to go. And this could be a side-by-side thing. It can be either there or wherever, and that's just the setup. And with that, there is obviously a thing. Look at the picture. There is no gateway so far in Azure at that point. So assume that you have a VDA that you absolutely need to connect to on the Azure side of your infrastructure. You require, no, that's wrong. You don't require a gateway, but you want to have a gateway there because otherwise users would have to connect to your gateway on premises, go through the MPLS express route back to Azure to connect to those VDAs in Azure. So the most natural consequence is you have a gateway there. Right? It's just another subscribable VM. You either bring your own license or you subscribe to the license as part of Azure. Doesn't matter. Both of them will work. And the good news is we will have that over the last webinars. Now Gateway, NetScaler in Azure is just ready to go. So all the previous problems with dual NIC support and stuff like that have gone away. So it just works. And if you're familiar with storefront technology, you know about gateway optimal routing, which makes sure that a certain VDA gets associated with a certain gateway so that the user gets the most closest route. That in the end means that latency is reduced as best as possible. So you have direct connections to any VDA in the closest circuit as possible. So in the end, each of those sites, so either premise or cloud, will have a gateway by itself and respective configuration to carry on the user there. With those multiple gateways, you require something that is transparent to your users. You don't want to instruct your users your endpoints. You don't want to give them out different login points just in case there is some issue. Here's the backup URL to connect your corporate. If there's a disaster, it will not work. That's just taken from reality. Each time you try to do that manually, it will absolutely fail. So you need an automated mechanism to make these two gateways on that screen feature par and functionality par, so the users actually don't know that, which in the end means you need to do some active-passive global server load balancing in between the Azure gateway and the on-premises gateway. You have, I would say, literally any option available that fits your needs. So it could be active-passive, it could be multi-active thing. So a lot of things are there to ensure that the user doesn't know about that infrastructure routing, but it just makes sure that he can connect in any case. So even if there is some malfunction on either your on-premise NetScaler or in your Azure NetScaler, the opposite member can take the role, of course, at the additional cost of sending users through the cloud, through the express route, back to the MPLS to the other end. But it is resilient, so you can make sure with that little trick that even standalone NetScalers on both ends would just work and carry on an HA requirement that satisfies your need. So that's the idea. And behind that idea, for sure, you will think about placing more components there. So placing the storefront there, NetScaler. So in the end, you duplicate your environment. So it really becomes a DR site. In terms of the cost savings perspective, may implement some mechanisms to at least shut down a bunch of VDAs so that at least those money doesn't go out of your hand that quickly. But of course, the middleware tier will be kept online like 24/7. So make sure that you select the right machines and billing plans to make sure that you don't get exploded with dollars in the end of the month. But at least the VDAs have some perspective that you can deal with in terms of capacity planning and cost. What you can do with that, obviously, if that is a feature-complete backup, so the DR side actually is a full active alternative, you have really that active passive GSOB gateway, just one FQDN. So global server load balancing ensures that you route the users either to the lower or to the upper side, depending on where the VDA is selected for hosting the application or desktop. All this is part of Storefront, like I would say forever, but for a very long time. This is something that is fully integrated with Storefront, even on the GUI perspective. So nothing spectacular at that point, I would say. If you're familiar with that, you will see it's the same stuff that you would build if you have an on-premises data center that you just duplicate with another on-premises data center. It doesn't matter if you actually tag these as a cloud. It's the same technology. And remember, you take care about that yourself in that example, at least. Same applies to Storefront. This is most oftenly overlooked, that you also have an internal need. Your right-hand lower portion receivers on corporate, they also expect to work day by day wise, regardless if either your on-premises side or your cloud side has an issue. So make sure that the GSOB perspective also deals with Storefront connections, so that in the end the user just doesn't notice if there is some kind of an outage. So that's the thing that we have there. Funny thing is that a lot of articles have been published out at least in the last 3 months about all these GSOB things. I actually did a large presentation for those that attended Synergy 2016 last year or so. Another 90 minutes. So most of the things that you see here is the same takeaway as from that previous presentation. If you don't have access to that, just shoot an email. It's still available. And most of the things that I went through are still available. So you can see that as an appendix slide or appendix deck for the things on screen right now. The resilience is solved with that point, but another question comes in. Isn't there an option to simplify all that? Because now you've duplicated all this stuff. So what to do now to do some cost savings? What can, for example, Citrix and Citrix Cloud, so Citrix apps and workspaces, can deliver for you if you assume that you just buy into something that I would simplify call as a desktop control plane. That's not the official notion, but think of it as this. And you introduce something where you replace the DDCs on premises. So previous screen was DDCs. So back again, it's now the connector. And connect those things into the Citrix Cloud. There's something important. Citrix Cloud basically runs also on Azure, but it's not the same Azure, right? It's their managed portion of Azure. So it's actually a third site, technically. It's even more than just a third site. It's another offering that also resides somewhere on the planet, where they can offer you hosting the DDCs. So taking away complexity, daily operations, and stuff like that. So it maybe makes sense for those that struggle with maintaining, for example, HA on the database, or that struggle with all those frequent update procedures that are required if you want to keep everything up to date. So maybe you want to simplify your administrative purposes to something like saying, I'm going to update my VDAs, but that's the thing I want to be responsible for, and all the other thing should be something that Citrix takes care of. There is a switch in terms of licensing, of course. There's a switch in terms of thinking about the operational needs, the SLA and stuff like that, but that could be a viable option as an addition. And with that, why not having the storefront there and getting rid of running storefront yourself? So just eliminate those things on site. Could be an option, right? And the same thing, obviously, is for the gateway. So there is a gateway as a service offering. I was saying, if you subscribe to something as a service, it potentially becomes simpler. it potentially becomes cheaper. It's eventually not decided, but there is a perspective of thinking of that, getting rid of those stuff, so you can have best of both worlds. So you operate VDAs and have, for example, the infrastructure maintained by somebody else. In that case, the vendor, which potentially knows it better than everybody else. So that's the thing. And looking at that picture, that was the initial notion of the slide that's saying, hey, when I go that way, why do I personally have to deal with NetScaler, for example? So let's look at this type of offering. If you subscribe to that service, you have these nice two sliders. So enable me a hosted storefront, enable me a gateway. And that's actually the thing. Great, right? So from an architect's perspective, from an engineer perspective, I would say you never ever deployed storefront and gateway that quickly, just with a slider. You need to do something else if you're on premise. Even if you're in Azure, you need to do something to get it running. It's just two sliders. There must be something different to your on-premises offering, right? So let's look at the thing, what that means. Just to make sure, all this is a moving target, right? If we talk about that today, that's today's recap. If we talk about that 3 months from now, a lot of things will have changed. So this is nothing for forever, but it's just the daily breakdown of what the feature is about. But think about the storefront connectivity first. So that's why the thing is blinking. I apologize for that, but it's just to make sure what we're talking about. It's the internal connectivity, right? Storefront is no longer on either premise or Azure in that example. So technology-wise, it takes that route. Looks funny, but technology-wise, it's needed. It has become a public storefront because of the software as a service architecture that it is made about. And that also means if one of these sites goes down, so either the on-premise or the Azure, your clients need a way to get there, right? So both of these connectivities that have their individual breakout, they need these backup purpose. That's an architectural difference, regardless of the fact that your storefront has become a public resource, which is also something that CISOs may look at differently. You need something there. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why the NetScaler SD-WAN deals with those breakouts internally. That's natural to that concept that some kind of internet breakout on each branch office is automatically there, regardless of what the other MPLS needs is about. So that's something here where the comparison between storefront on-premise and storefront as a service is a little bit unfair because it's not the same product, or it's the same product, not the same functionality. And so you need, for example, to think about authentication strength and authentication needs, which is different as a public resource. And you need to think about all these infrastructure things to connect your users. So make sure that this is the thing you want to have and not just something you get just because it's there. But it could be something very interesting. Assuming that this is not your first desire, look at the other thing. So the gateway. There's a gateway as a service offering. This is a huge offering, by the way, because that one gateway that is on screen right now actually is a global server load balanced gateway with, I would say, it's 9 breakouts right now. Could be even more today. So you have a gigantic, resilient gateway all around the globe. So especially for traveling users, that is something you don't build yourself that easily. Remember, it was just a slider to enable the thing, and you get that multi-location, multi-region, multi-continent gateway, which essentially feels like one, but technology-wise is a great, gigantic one. But think about the way the traffic has to go through. That's just because of technology. They connect to the Citrix cloud in any Azure place, most likely close to you as best as possible. But in the end, the way back to your VDA, the HTTP connection has to be proxied back to the connector to the VDA. If you have sensitive applications that really work best only in case that you have the best direct connection, this is eventually a negative impact, regardless of the architecture approach. So you need to think about how that actually works like. The other thing, this is also important because that's depending on the specific gateway as a service offering. There are different plans that are available. There are some kind of limitations available or that need to be respected today because of, for example, Azure limitations, like EDT is still an issue because of UDP in Azure is kind of a hell. There's still an unsolved mystery there. What I think is the most interesting differentiation to what Gateway is about in comparison to on-premises deployments, that is it actually non-authenticating. It's just proxying the storefront to get the authentication done and making sure that you can have an SSL connection to that gateway and then essentially reach your VDAs. But in terms of these pre-authentication things that typically get associated when you deploy gateways, that is something that at least isn't there in the standard offering. So make sure that it's really the thing that you want to have. So integration with MFA and all those things is nothing that you need to expect that they are there. You need to verify, depending on the offering, how much you can do there at that point. So eventually, with those positive or negative aspects of that, it may come back to the point that you say, hey, gateway is something I want to maintain myself because of the optimal routing advantages. So I have this direct route. And eventually, because of that storefront thing and scaling to corporate class availability and routing needs and security requirements, I have these GSOB on the front end, and I also will still have the storefront taken back internally and have the same as shown before. But I still have those Citrix Cloud with the thing because of the obvious advantage that somebody else takes care about versioning, then somebody takes care about the HA, the database, things like that. So it is eventually something that I see a lot of customers really having a problem with these evergreen patching. That's the technology notion, that evergreen patching is one of the things that are needed if you are not going on LTSR. And LTSR means you have kind of a frozen environment technology like 18 months or more. A lot of deployments require more innovation than just an 18 months update cycle. And evergreen patching for on-premises can become costly, especially with database around and stuff like that. So this is something where that software as a service, Zen Desktop offering, still has great advantages in terms of doing that yourself, especially if you're not the gigantic best guy on SQL. So that's the thing here. So it could be something to consider. If you have seen that across the different slide animations, I've also allowed me to bring the Amazon logo back into the screen. So what previously had been your on-premises data center now has become an Amazon site, so that MPLS has now an express route and a direct connect attached. This is just to showcase that in the end, it doesn't matter what the cloud actually is. It can be a software as a service, Azure cloud, hosted and operated with Citrix stuff. It can an Azure stuff hosted by yourself. It can be something on AWS hosted yourself. It doesn't matter. So the picture remains true in many of these variations. So with that, that was the overview, just to give you an idea why just because going to cloud, that not necessarily takes away the need to deal with NetScaler more in detail than ever, because you're now actively providing access to 2 active sites, or you need to make sure that in case of a planned failover scenario, you need to that you're taking care about active passive things and stuff like that. So there's really a need to do that. And the other thing that is mostly kept behind is the need to have GSOB for the store from the internal end as well. That's something where I've seen what the surprise typically is in. With that, that was the infrastructure perspective where NetScaler has a role in Azure in that example, and also here in Amazon in the place. The offering is right now that you may have something in your mind that I went through too quickly, where the transition wasn't good, or your bandwidth wasn't enough to keep live with the screen. So you have these questions box in your GoToWebinar. We do some little break to collect all those in. So type whatever you want to have in terms of clarifications. I'm trying to go there quickly through and give you some answers. If there is nothing for that and you're just waiting to continue, I'm just waiting for arrivals, and I'm also open to collect that in the end. So I don't see any hands up. You may know that there is a hands up functionality in GoToWebinar as well, so nobody is in trouble so far. Okay, there's the first one. Thanks, Chris, to that. Gateway as a service and multi-factor authentication. That's the thing that I was talking about. I quickly go to the respective slides so that makes sense for all of us. We're talking about this functionality. There we go. So here, as I was saying, gateway offering traditionally it's just a pass-through mechanism, and plus on top the HTTP proxy. Um, I don't know how much of that plan has made it into a productized offering. The last check that I did that morning, you could not describe to the enterprise version of that service. So my most honest answer is I don't have a date for that. But I see that that will be coming for sure. It's just a matter of fact that you have so many moving parts when cloudifying that Citrix offering as a service, that the decision was to say, okay, we just provide the basic functionality. I know a lot of customers these days that still are around without any type of multi-factor authentication. I'm not saying that I'm a fan of that, but I see that reality. So for those, it actually doesn't matter really much if that is just a pass-through thing. MFA is there. Maybe I was too fast with that. You can enable MFA on that hosted storefront. Looks a little bit different because it's just not that storefront that you have on premises. It's just a product, but not exactly the same binary. So you can have MFA even there, with the obvious drawback that it also then applies to internal connections. But most honestly, I don't have a date for the delivery. So watch out on that. I think it's interesting. I've seen that Citrix has acknowledged the need. I don't have a date. And as remember, we CDPs are not Citrix. We're just saying the thing how it is. So unfortunately, no specific one. Something from Kim. If I do use NetScaler on-prem with Citrix Cloud, do you recommend to have Storefront on-prem too, or is it a must-have? Okay, that's interesting. That picture, which components have to be software as a service and which can be software as a service, that's actually a little tricky, so to say. If you have subscribed to Storefront in Citrix Cloud, you, so far as I'm aware of, must choose the gateway as a service to combine those two things. If you have gateway there, you also are required to the same way. So the thing is, you still have access to the XML functionality of the DDC through the connector. So that's the reason why you can build Storefront yourself, because you can still do XML to controllers. You still have a way to get there. So I wouldn't say I recommend that, but obviously it reads nicely if that gateway as a service is a 9, I think it's a 9 region large offering GSLD one, which you can't do yourself. So as a consultant, the answer typically would be it depends, which you obviously don't like to hear, I guess. But it really depends on the situation. So I wouldn't say it's an all-in or it's a recommended combination of either A and B. It really depends a little bit. And the main problem is it is a moving target, right? A lot of these things are under review. A lot of things will change over time because a lot of customers that are early onboarders report back their experiences and they report back their expectations. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't go forward with the product as a customer, but they have their wish list. And of course, I would say those wish list items from existing customers are taken care of first. And then it comes to the wish list of those that are just dealing with POC stuff. That's a typical vendor thing. So I don't have something that I actually can disclose. And as I was saying, if we redo that webinar in 3 months from now, eventually the answers will be different. So if I print that down right now, it's valid for a week, eventually 2, and then we have to review how the service is still about. So sorry for not being precisely on that. It's from Kim, if I'm correctly for now. Yeah, the idea to that. So the question is, if Storefront Gateway is a required combination, so if the one component is on-prem, the other should be as well. I would say the most fair answer is yes. You go either both components on-prem and just leave Citrix with the DDC stuff and database stuff, and use that as a service, or you give them both. But the combination of having the one component with them and the other with you will not be the best payout. I think that's the fair answer to that. It's an either or, but nothing where you can actually mix. So I have a bunch of timers here on my desk, and one of them reminds me that in case you want to finish that more or less in time that I would close the question 1 series right now. So I'm giving you back this screen that we had previously. It came from here. I'm still taking a question on part 1, so if you in the next minutes find out that I'm still leaving something behind, just type. But please do me a favor, in case of, just prefix those questions with like kind of P1 or whatever, because when I later read the part 2 questions, then I would skip them at that point and come back to that later. That simplifies a lot for me, so thank you for that. So that was infrastructure. The idea is to now look at the application end, which obviously means Azure AD and Office 365. And again, the question how NetScaler fits into that picture. So another compilation of logos and requirements. And if we start that type of discussion with our customers, the most commonly heard question is, oh, I come go away with that. You just want to talk about that lame authentication thing. And kind of, yes, I want to talk about authentication actually, because I think that is important. It is important to understand how your on-premises stuff, that to my impression will not go away that easily. I would say I will live with hybrid for the next, I don't know, 10+ years, but that's just a personal bet. You need to understand how those existing investments and those existing user identities make it over into the cloud, and how you deal with those requirements in a technically meaningful way and without making your users angry day by day. So it's sometimes about those Easter eggs that somebody just hasn't written down that they are there, and things to discover. And so I would like to give you a picture, and this is the initial picture. It's about Office 365 enterprise needs. And this is really something I would say you will have seen in many other presentations already. The thing is, on the left-hand side, this is your on-premises stuff, which basically is an Active Directory and other things. This is where your users reside, right? And then you subscribe to Office 365 for whatever reason. It can be because of licensing simplification. You may actively pursue the way to get even your data there. In the end, you will have that over the course of time, right? And then the question comes up, how the hell does all that stuff work? Because obviously 365 is just an application on top of Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory has accounts, same as your Active Directory on premises consists of accounts and groups. Azure AD provides the same ground foundation layer for any application that resides in Azure. So it's no longer about infrastructure, it's about an application need to personalize content and to authenticate a user. You need a session in the end. And there are multiple ways to synchronize your Active Directory into Azure AD. So Azure AD Connect is the #1 tool that you require. And in terms of enterprise deployments, the majority of CISOs doesn't want you to have the passwords copied over. It's actually not the passwords themselves, just the hashes, but they dislike the idea that somebody just copies over the hashes into Azure and just allows for login at that place. And that's the reason why the majority of those that are familiar with those security need or the security requirement, depends on your perspective, that the ADFS has become a natural component to that play. So meaning we have the user that goes to an Office 365 offering, so either a webified Word or a native Skype for Business or OneDrive on your Windows 10 machine, wherever, and it needs an authenticated session there. And if you do not just copy over the accounts, those so-called shadow accounts are not usable unless somebody from the on-premise perspective grants you with a login ticket. So there is a relationship between the application and something that you host on-premises wise, so an identity provider technology, which mainly comes under the umbrella of ADFS, that does the authentication with existing credentials that the user obviously has. The question comes up if multi-factor can be integrated with the ADFS story easily. Answer again is it depends. And with that back, you get the authenticated ticket and you got your sessions. That's basically the thing. And there's nothing wrong with that, but just to make sure. This is, from an enterprise perspective, the standard way to make sure that at no point in time a password is copied, and at no point in time a credential is directly sent either into Azure AD or proxied through Azure AD. There are some evolutions in the way you can connect to Azure these days. But one of these write back style solutions is that you actually post your credentials to Office 365 and relay them back to you. That's not the thing here. We're talking about that 365 apps or any Azure AD driven app relays back to you on premises wise and asks for a login mechanism and never personally displays a login credential box for you. So that's the good thing. What is not that perfect in that world, as far as I've seen working with a lot of customers, that of course ADFS is the number one choice for majority of those that say, hey, Federation is my perfect way to go with Azure. I would say it's that 95 is just my personal limit. Also about the statistics behind it, just the impression that I've taken away over the long time. But what I've also taken away is that I would say more than half of those customers, they just deploy ADFS just like next, and hopefully it will just work. But the majority disregards what isn't best practice to actually work with ADFS. And the problem obviously comes with Google. We like Google, yeah, just to make sure everybody likes Google. But the thing is, if you type the right search notion into Google, the response and the top 5 responses not necessarily reflect the right answers, right? It's just statistic and hit rate and sometimes advertised promotion things. So the thing is, the number one on Google is not necessarily the right answer to go on-premises deploy. So you have two things that I see are typically violated. The first thing, HA is not taken care of. So standalone ADFS things. A lot of people are saying, hey, it's just ADFS, nobody cares. But the thing is, you never, in your today's world, would operate a standard domain controller as a single entity. You always have a second one. And so as it is about authentication, why would you go with just a single ADFS node? It doesn't make sense. If it is a critical application need and authenticating to the cloud becomes a natural requirement, you need an HA solution for Federation as well. And the second thing, which I personally think is much more severe, a lot of these deployments do not take care about the need that an external user has to undergo a different authentication than an internal user. It's just that single box, and hopefully it will just work, as I've said before. Because the right deploy will look like this. This is the thing that I see less often, honestly. I see some customers doing that, actually. And you see all the additional needs that come with that. So the natural deploy would be an HA-ADFS with kind of a load balancing mechanism in front of that. And this is technically the authentication front end for Federation for your corporate users. Whereas your mobile users, your rogue warriors, whatever, all those that are outside of your on-premises or MPLS network, they have to go to the web application proxy plus some additional multi-factor authentication enforcement in case that your security policy mandates the use of MFA outside the corporate network, which likely is a good choice. And this is a way more complex deploy, right? But it's actually the best practice. And it also leaves behind the question if you have a portal functionality so that the users intuitively can get there. So a lot of things come to discuss. And what also comes with there is a myth. I hear that very often. If you compare that, the majority is saying, oh, by the way, if you want to do all these fancy things, where the user just doesn't notice that it is either on-prem or outside authentication with the same functionality, you just can't do that with NetScaler. It's just not versatile enough. And actually, this is something that was true a few years ago, but reality also says today, the NetScaler picture just looks like this. If you see forth and back, so from here to there, it's nothing rocket science. You can build the same stuff. The nice advantage is that you can collapse the number of moving parts that you need to maintain. And as I assume that you also will have the need for example, for HDX connections and stuff like that, you have the NetScaler in your DMZ anyway. So the technology is there, functionality is there. It just has to be enabled and giving a birth, I would say. You will also see that, especially for that picture, it really emulates a web application proxy and an ADFS. Excuse me. It emulates those layers side by side with two different IPs. There you will see a lot of different approaches. You can have the idea to have a single login point that can differentiate internal and external users just with different authentication schemes. My personal recommendation is that these types of collapsed deployments, as I call them, become very complex. And as Microsoft more or less provides you the blueprint to have it like this, I would recommend actually doing those internal users on a different authentication whip than the external ones, even on the same box, eventually in a partition, which greatly simplifies the configuration that you will need to configure inside the NetScaler to provide forms-based authentication with likely MFA for the external users, which, by the way, can be the same authentication page that you use for your Zen Desktop HD Access needs, Unified Gateway needs, can be literally the same listener, and provide another VIP on the inside tier of your network, where you enable silent Kerberos authentication capabilities so that the users do not get nagged with authentication screens and just get silently authenticated. So the technology, in the end, is similar to ADFS. With ADFS, you typically have WS Federation, Web Service Federation. If it comes to third-party federation with Azure AD in 365, you're required to have SAML support. Security Assertion Markup Language is the technology that is the #1 third-party offering that any federation partner today has to offer. So Microsoft mandates this functionality. A lot of offerings, such as NetScaler and others, have this functionality, and that's the way how you create your tickets. For those interested in the details of that, I did a synergy session this year, by the way, on SAML. That presentation deck is also available, so in case you missed that, that's also downloadable to get you more details on how that stuff works. But in the end, the outcome is the same. You create abstracted login data to give your user access to the Azure AD Zoo. It looks like artificial. Sometimes it looks surprisingly. I think the best way is to show that to you. A few words before rolling that. You need to notice the background color of the screen. So when a screen is on blue, it is a user's perspective. If the screen turns to a red background color, it is something that an administrator maintains on a given system, just to make sure that you have the fadings in good sense. So we start with the administrative version, so red. First thing, we connect to Azure AD and make sure that it is configured with SAML, so it's already set up. Then we go to our client, so blue. We enable a wide area connection, so DSL style, so being an external user, which in that example, as it is an enterprise deploy, requires the use of multi-factor authentication. So we go there to our corporate portal, log in with MFA and stuff like that, and we have our unified gateway. And as a natural consequence, you have ShareFile, you have Office 365 and other SAML-enabled applications in there. And with just a click through, they welcome you with no further demand and personalize the page as your identity. So that's just a straightforward way of collapsing resources for your users. Once you have the authentication, you can even use deep link functionality, so go directly to a certain folder in those offerings. Can work with third-party apps in the same way, so you collapse that pretty much easily. And the opposite way is when you go first to the app, so you go to Word 365, for example, as the first starting point. Office 365 asks you for identity. You say, I'm an enterprise user. And similar to the ADFS, you get asked for your email, which is enabled for federation. So it switches back to the on-premises NetScaler and does the same authentication mask that you've seen before. So you have user, password, multi-factor, and stuff like that. And you get welcomed into Word. So that's a forms-based approach, because remember that user is now a remote client outside the corporate network. Once he has an authenticated tab, of course, the other tabs share that identity and authentication mechanism, so you can just use all the other accesses like ShareFile and other applications in the same way. In a browser, obviously, that always looks pretty much simple because browsers have these free flow to include other resources. But it works with the native apps as well. So let's use OneDrive. So you use your user identity there. And same way as in the browser, those apps spin up an embedded browser and ask for credentials. So you see the embedded HTML with still the NetScaler forms in that case, signs you in, you're good to go. So it doesn't matter, it's Skype, Business, OneDrive, or anywhere, whatever. So all these things primarily work the same way forward. So it's about embedding web-based authentication mechanisms. And of course, NetScaler can satisfy that. Until this point, this is not rocket science because that was forms-based authentication. I don't know how long we do forms-based authentication on NetScaler. Any given gateway does that for 10 plus years right now. So the interesting point is what happens if you go to the internal corporate network. So switching back that setup, so restoring everything to scratch mode in unconfigured way, we now use the local area connection on that client. So we are a domain member, obviously, otherwise Kerberos wouldn't kick in. We're using the same flow right now. So I'm using an deep access link to ShareFile. Of course, ShareFile needs to ask me what's my employee. And at that point, the forms interaction just doesn't appear. It's just Kerberos authentication in between you and your NetScaler. You get the assertion for the respective offerings, so either ShareFile, 365, whatever application. And so at that point, it feels pretty much natural for the user. There's no next screens, and stuff just goes forward like this. Any given other application just goes that way. That is pretty much powerful, I would say, and straightforward for the user. Again, those native apps behave the same way. Even if it is an embedded browser flow, Kerberos still works. So you see that quickly going through and disappearing. So nothing magic to that. It just works. It personalizes your applications. And at that point, you're good to go. That's the thing. How you can have a single NetScaler box doing both forms-based for external users, respecting MFA needs and whatever, and at the same time doing Kerberos for your internal users, which obviously requires Windows domain-based machines with domain accounts on that. If you have other workgroup, whatever scenarios, you will have a prompt kind of internally, NTLM, whatever. So the natural component requires the Windows backend, which obviously will also work if those internal client, for example, is a VDA. So if you log in from the outside using HDX on a given VDA, let's say full screen desktop, publish app, whatever, now you are on the inside network, want to leverage OneDrive functionality or whatever on the internal LAN, you have that silent login there available as well. Just saying. But again, this is still kind of a classic deploy. What I've seen in my daily business goes a little bit further. If customers really say cloud first, a lot of things, I would say, slide out of your hands. I think that's a good notion of that. You have new challenges. If cloud first is the gameplay, that essentially means we reverse the picture. So let's say there is a customer saying, I still have on-premises stuff for sure. It will not go away completely, but I'm going the way forward with Azure AD as my main login scenario. There's nothing wrong with that, it's just an option. We honestly see that more like on a business-to-business scenario, where you need to host business accounts, not necessarily for the employee side of things, but those requirements exist where you live in Azure AD as the primary home base. You may have heard there's an Azure Access Panel, which is, I would say, it's not similar to NetScaler Unified Gateway, but it's a point where you can accumulate resources so the user has nice tiles to click through. So at least you can provide a single pane of glass for applications. So you authenticate there with Azure, with the existing Azure MFA functionality, for example. So it's still in a secure, it's provided in a secure way, so it's nothing less secure than it would be like the on-prem stuff. The thing is now, you still may have the need to provide access to on-premise resources. Maybe Outlook Web is not the best candidate, but it's a good technology example. More likely, Zen Desktop is needed, so kind of a Windows resource that has not made it over into the cloud completely, that heavily relies on things that you cannot give up in terms of your on-premises needs, they need a session, right? So the picture is the same as with 365 before. You need a session on the left-hand side because you now come from the right-hand side. And obviously, the user goes to the right-hand side. With those lessons learned, you know you need kind of a SAML authentication mechanism to establish a session on the left-hand side because you still need a shadow account on the left-hand side. Nothing in AD will work without a user. So obviously, you need a shadow user for any Azure AD user. So the same way as you previously had a look at Office 365, just the opposite way. The thing is, you now get there and you need to establish a session. And for the Microsoft perspective, this is now done. They have pulled those products that previously had the ability to help you out with that. Because think about the left-hand side, it's a Windows-based application in terms of all the web app that requires a Windows session. More severe in Zen Desktop, it is a full desktop session that requires a Windows user to be logged in. The last thing you want to have is dedicated accounts where somebody now types credentials because of security reason, because of comfort, because of a variety of things that doesn't work. So you need something that works more silently. The good news in that example obviously comes with the help of NetScaler. So you can consider NetScaler also being a service provider. Remember the previous examples. In that example, the Office apps had been the service provider application. Now it's opposite-wise. You are the service provider. You need to make sure that you can log in with Azure credentials into your on-premises environment in a silent way, which is tricky because you obviously can provide that service provider endpoint with NetScaler. That's the easy point. The more complex requirement now is that those Windows apps still require Windows credentials, which still isn't there. You just have the SAML login, which is just an abstracted login ID. So user ID, UPN, whatever, is typically the UPN in most cases. And you now need to run a session. Technology-wise, NetScaler can help you directly because NetScaler knows about Kerber's constraint delegation. So when NetScaler knows your ID, so especially your UPN, which comes as part of the assertion, it can, on behalf of those users, create a Kerberos session. It requires a certain dedicated delegated service account to be granted with those privileges. But in the end, it can personalize that web session for other web app so that you naturally can display other web app without any interruptions. Even more complex is the Zen Desktop because at that point, KCD is pulled from product support. That has been something that Microsoft has taken care of, that no longer is supported. And in the days earlier when it was supported, it was really a help. So if you ever tried to do KCD on Zen App 6 whatever days on IMA infrastructure, I can tell you stories about that. It kind of worked, but that was really not scaling for enterprise. With Zen Desktop, there's absolutely no more support to do KCD-based logins, but the good news is that Citrix has invented the Federated authentication services, which primarily creates virtual smart cards, and virtual smart cards is officially supported by Microsoft. So you get your session. So the conjunction at that point is that NetScaler hands off that identity to the storefront, which then hands over to the FAS and creates a session. This is the interesting thing, which I also want to show you. Remember the coloring. Red means the administrative perspective, blue means the user. So basic example, we start with my Azure demo portion with my 2 user accounts. I have a Windows-based user and I have an Azure AD-based user to show you both perspectives for the same functionality. So it's not really reality, but it helps illustrating the thing. So I've created a NetScaler tile. So the unified gateway is now an Azure app, and that app is enabled for SAML authentication. That's the basic story behind that. It loads a little bit, and you see that this app is made based on SAML-based sign-on. Some parameters, some certificates to exchange, but nothing spectacular. User side, we start with the corporate user. So we go to Azure AD My Apps, but we authenticate with an on-premises account. May look ugly, but this is a use case that actually exists in the world. So we authenticate to Azure, same way as to Office 365 previously. So obviously our identity provider kicks in and then grants over the assertion, and we land into the app space. Within that app space, there is that NetScaler resource, which is the unified gateway. Brings us back to the same functionality I've shown before. So sign and log in, no more prompts, you just get there. And I've provided you here 4 example applications. So with an HDX PowerPoint example, sign and log in, nothing spectacular. We have a share file, we have some proprietary SAML application, and we have our web app on the right-hand side. So that was the PowerPoint HDX. Pretty good start. Minimizing that, then we have the share file, just a web application that is another SAML hop, so to say. Just works. And we have a proprietary one, just to illustrate that it's not just industry applications, industry standard applications, but also proprietary things. And we have our web app. Everything smoothly just running. But this is the simple example because I used the on-premises account, so you could suspect that this is kind of a fake display. Technology-wise, it wasn't, but as I started with an on-premises account, of course it had to work. You always can start HDX sessions with an on-premises account. So let's see the opposite perspective. So restoring everything to a pristine state, starting with my Azure account instead now. So when I now type my credentials, I do not get redirected to my IDP. Now I use Azure AD. So I type my on Microsoft.com address. I didn't manipulate that. I have my password, have my MFA enabled from my smartphone. So that's my iOS device receiving the SMS MFA. Getting here, typing over. So we have strong authenticated login to the same portal, which has less tiles, but still NetScaler is here. And now we go to the on-prem NetScaler that requires Windows technology for the different applications. The display here is just simple, but now we start with the heavy things. We start with ShareFile, which is not that heavy because it's just another chain of SAML. So starting from an Azure AD credential with SAML to the NetScaler, doing another SAML to ShareFile. The same applies for the proprietary application. That's just chaining SAML technology. It's nice from technology, but nothing rocket science. More interesting is Outlook web app. At that point, NetScaler has to do Kerberos authentication with delegation to have my user identity used for display silently. And the hardest example in that case, from a technology perspective, is now launching an HDX session, which means that the FAS in the background has created a certificate as a virtual smart card to make sure that this session really can launch. So very powerful thing. Remember, that user just had been provided with an Azure AD account, plus MFA support for the smartphone, and had no clue about the on-premises Windows authentication technology. No Windows password awareness. He even doesn't know the user UPN that was used for that. Of course, if it does Control-Alt-Delete, he gets to the identity portions inside of Windows, but he has no chance of altering that credential. It just works. And the reason why I'm showing you these two examples is because of that. That's part of the thing in the world where I work today with my customers. I see that we have this bridge in between two needs. We have an employee that has on-premises needs and applications living on the outside world in the cloud more and more. And you need a bridge technology to get there, which traditionally can be, in my perspective, NetScaler as the best choice. And there's also the other perspective where you have business partners that also need access to parts of your assets, parts of your apps, which also can be on-premises or cloud located, and which also requires bridge technology to come from the right to left-hand side. So that's the thing where NetScaler becomes a very powerful tool. So from a 10,000 feet perspective, this is the thing you go to your manager to get the budget. Please do not show this picture because then the budget will be taken away from you instantly. But this is a technology behind. You need to, if you want to do something like this, where the employees live on the left-hand side and the business partners live on the right-hand side, which is exactly that example, you can have the best things out of both worlds and do not have to differentiate if there are certain apps that eventually will not work, because the left-hand side just works with on-premises or with federated accounts from Azure. And the right-hand side works with either Azure accounts or with federated accounts from the left-hand side. So you have also the option to see this as a migration path for moving certain accounts from either left to right or right to left-hand side. So it actually depends on what your strategy in behind is. So that's a huge security thing. That's why I'm calling this secured hybrid shared infrastructure piece. If you have better names for that, I'm taking suggestions. As we talk about security, there's an important heads up for you guys. It is October the 5th, where we are planning to give you something that has this boring thing of security presented in a way that is actually entertaining enough. We hopefully get that done. That's the lineup that we have committed today. There are some co-workers also contributing to that. That is a large one, so allocate time for that. We would welcome you, not kind of the whole day, but this is a long XL user share webinar, so save the date, please. Could be very interesting, I think, with lineup and agenda still being built, but we have some very cool ideas just to talk about security. With that, part 2 is also done. As I was saying, we need another break. So Q&A, another one. I'm going back to my question deck while you are also invited to type. Let me think here. Device registration. So Stefan, thanks for asking, does device registration work? That's the ugly thing today. If you need to join the Win 10 machine this way to Azure AD, that's under work. I think it's the most fair answer to that. We're working with the product group on closing certain gaps where Microsoft has a proprietary starting point. And that device registration is really something that doesn't fall into a standard authentication protocol. So that's unfortunately an open wound where we don't have a perfect solution so far. And so the answer is no. We'll see. It's again here, as I was saying, those content is a moving target. Maybe ask in 3 or 6 months from now. There are things coming, but the timeline is not committed. So maybe or not. Something from Amit to ensure. Okay, it's about this picture. Before I read the question, I'm giving you the picture where we talk about. It is this one. I introduced this slide with the idea that you emulate ADFS in the same way as it is built naturally. So when Microsoft comes with that, the recommendation is think about this instead of collapsing everything into a single IP. And the question from Ahmed is, so VIP1, the upper one, is secured by MFA, which is obviously, so the MFA is on the diagram. And yes, the MFA is linked to the VIP1 forms authentication, which was in the demo. So the brute force mechanism is mitigated as best as possible. And by the way, it's the same MFA thing that you use, for example, for the HDX gateway. And in essence, the VIP1 is the gateway. So if you have an existing HDX setup with MFA protection, you can upgrade those things to support Office 365 forms authentication easily. So that's the nice portion of that. And VIP2, the low one for the Kerberos, and obviously, as it is Kerberos, is just available to internal clients, can be a non-routable IP. There's a firewall in between anyway, but this one just leverages Kerberos without MFA. So yes, upper one MFA, lower one just Kerberos. Should be good. Another one. Okay, from Stefan, another question about claims. So claims, nothing else ensemble, just to make sure each time you read about claims authentication in the Microsoft white paper, they technically talk about federated authentication. So a SAML assertion takes place of that. So how about conditional access? This is something where the concept is different. Conditional access is tightly integrated into the pure Azure story. So conditional access is something that you do on NetScaler with, for example, endpoint analytics. That's the replacement component for it. What you cannot do is have conditional access terms and taggings and flags inside the apps to be married with the NetScaler or whatever third-party SAML IDP. That just doesn't work. It's two different ends. So the IDP itself has to provide conditional access capabilities, which NetScaler does. If it is the same as Azure, that's debatable, but a lot of use cases will be available without any negative aspect to that. I think that's a fair answer, hopefully. Seeing there's another, let me quickly see. Okay, so no, that's the last. There's some duplicates that I do not repeat. In case I've missed something, apologize. We will do a cleanup for all these questions in the end. Again, another one from Stefan again, ActiveSync authentication. That's an interesting question. You know that ActiveSync is a legacy client, and that legacy client requires the SOAP adapter to collect in the assertion. This is one of the things that is on the radar, because there are still some guys around that need especially that. I would say we see that coming. Right today, there is no firmware that can deliver, but from the needed components, NetScaler has everything on box already, but the SOAP service interface is not established yet. So I have a little hope that you get there earlier than later. We are working in labs with several things. I don't know, it's really, maybe it's also a question to you, all you guys. Feature parity in between a third-party IDP, such as NetScaler, and, for example, ADFS is desirable, but the question is if we really need 100% feature parity, if the functionality that is covered with that is just for less than 1% of the world. In the ActiveSync example, I understand and agree that it's a little different, but the question is how far do we have to push the Citrix to go forward with functionality that today eventually is not shipping. If you have got certain ideas, kind of wish list, whatever, also shoot that as a question mark. I'm trying to hand that over to the right guys and get back to you with an answer in case they let me give you that answer. So if it's NDA, I can't do anything to that, but at least I can try to push that in the right channel and create kind of an awareness to that. So hopefully that's a good answer for that. With that, there's the last thing I may not forget. My PowerPoint is not cooperating. Wait, we are coming right here. Closing the part 2. As I was saying, we have, for those that are still with us in the end, a nice giveaway. So first, thank you. Remember, October 5th. Stephanie will make sure that the registration is available soon. Not today, but we will get there when the lineup gets finished, agenda and stuff like that. But so, if nothing changes, it's between 1 and 4 p.m. Eastern. Eventually subject to change, but that's the plan. And again, as I was saying, there is a quiz for those that attended both of the parts today. That should be easy. Here's the thing how to deal with that. We have 3 potential winners. And the thing is, we use the question box as the panel to send the answer. I know it sounds ridiculous, but the answer to my question is actually the question that you post there. And also importantly, as we need to tick the timings, you need to give a 2-part answer in just 1 question. So you have 1 shoot, and this is question number 1. Giving the technology name that is required to distribute HDX connections between on-premises and Azure using NetScaler. And the second part of the question that you just can send when you read the question is this: give me the name for the authentication protocol to do federation between your on-premises and Azure AD. And the first 3 correct answers get something. So we do the timestamp for the incoming question, which actually is the answer. Stephanie is about to help me with that. As I was saying, you need to type both. 1 and 2 must be the same in 1 question. We don't have any winners yet. It's getting close. I would say Sean is okay with that. Still waiting. No, we're still waiting for the place number 2 and 3. Perfect. Kim has one. And the third, is there somebody to come? Before I officially give the answer, because you still have to type, right? Okay, we have nobody. We can close with less than that. But remember, both answers need to be in 1 line. Otherwise, we can't track that. Closer, but still not there. Okay, here's the offering. The webinar is recorded, so you can scroll to any place of the presentation. The slides itself are also available for download, so you don't have to scroll through a movie. You just can use PowerPoint to get the right place. The third shirt is kept with us. The first two ones get it for the right answer, which is on number 1, GSOD, and the second one is Samuel. So thanks for that. We are done with that. Again, thank you. If you like those things, stay tuned for the security webinar. Give us feedback what we should do different. Give me feedback on especially that session. We have a survey ready to fill out. As far as I've seen, Stephanie has also posted a link in the chat. This also helps us planning and doing things. And again, thanks to all of that. Stephanie, if you're still with us, I'm done with all stuff. Maybe you want to say some cheers, and with me, I would say thanks again and bye.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation and a lot of good questions, and I absolutely will take care of the winners of the t-shirts and reach out to you guys after the webinar. Again, I put some links in the chat for you. I have a link to the forum thread on mycugc.org. If more questions come up for you later, feel free to type those in there. And also a link to a quick survey. It's anonymous. It's very, very short, and it helps us get feedback on the webinars as well as plan all of our future webinars. And I think we have a third winner, Thorsten.
Yeah, okay.
So
after I've said that, it was at least
it doesn't count, does it?
We count that, and we just want to give them out. We count Ahmed in because it was pretty close, but if now anybody else just copies in that answer, they will not grant it for shirts. But the first 3 ones are now settled.
I have them all written down.
Thanks much, guys.
Okay, thank you, guys. You'll get the link to recording tomorrow afternoon, and we hope to see you back at another CUGC webinar soon. Thanks, Thorsten.
See you. Bye.